So first things first, this converter is basically a small lens group designed to magnify the output of a lens, in this case by a factor of 2. It's a very simple device with no moving parts, which makes them a convenient way to get some extra reach. So up at the front we have a section that actually mounts to the lens. You'll notice this part here, which extends a bit further outside of the body, which necessitates the use of a unique lens cap for the extender. You want to make sure you don't lose this, because if you do, you'll have no way to protect this side of the converter in your bag. I've misplaced it many times, and I either just leave it attached to the lens I was using it on, or I'll try to sandwich it in my bag with a standard cap and try to leverage it against something so it doesn't come off. But that's obviously not ideal and hasn't really worked out very well for me, so just make sure you don't lose this cap. As a quick note, this extension right here at the front is also what determines what lenses you can and can't use this converter with. So make sure your lens that you plan to use it with is compatible. For Canon L lenses, it can only be used with a focal length of 135mm or more per Canon's website. Since this is the side that mounts to the lens, it's essentially the same as a camera body mounting surface. It uses the same lockup, and you have a release button right here that actuates basically the same pin that you would see on your camera body. You also have the red dots to line everything up, and you have another red dot on the rear to mount it to the camera itself. Now, the rear is essentially the same as any lens, which means it uses the exact same cap. I can't really compare it on the table here, so I'll include a photo of this versus my 70-200, and you can see that it's pretty much exactly the same. Now, this does beg the question of whether or not you can stack these converters. The answer is technically yes. It can be done provided the extension on this side doesn't interfere with anything. So there are certain variants that will stack in a certain way and some that won't. I've seen experiments where people have combined 5 2x extenders as a joke, really, but it just shows that it can technically be done. Unsurprisingly, the photos don't turn out so well, not to mention that you would lose so much light in the process that it's just not practical. So while we're here, you can see that there is also a rubber gasket. So if you are using a weather sealed lens, then you can maintain your weather seal while using the converter. The actual guts of the converter itself is comprised of 9 lens elements with various coatings to minimize unwanted effects. Again, there's no moving parts, and overall I've found it to be pretty rugged as a result. The lockup has been good as well. There's a very small amount of play, of course, but no more than you would see with any other lens, and it's never really been an issue for me. So today we're talking about the 2x converter, specifically the Canon EF 2x3. I'm going to talk about my personal experience using this extender and whether or not it's worth getting one. So all the 2x converter is a lens group that attaches to the back of another lens, and it magnifies the picture created by this lens. In this case, I have a 70-200 2.8, and it turns it into a 140-400 f5.6. You'll notice, along with doubling the focal length, I also doubled the maximum aperture. It's just due to how the converter works. If you want to get a better technical understanding of why exactly that is, there's plenty of graphics and articles online that'll do that. But for me, what's more important is how it affects my images. So first up, let's talk about the image quality, and specifically the sharpness and detail. The main thing that you need to know anytime you're going to use a 2x converter is there's always going to be a drop in sharpness and detail. And that's certainly true with this particular converter and this setup that I've primarily used it with. And the reason is because all you're really doing is zooming into the picture created by this lens. So if this is your starting point, anytime you slap on a 2x converter, you're magnifying that image, and you're always going to lose a little bit of sharpness and detail as a result. So even though you're going to always lose image quality using the 2x converter, it doesn't mean that you can't get great shots. Typically what I do to mitigate that loss of sharpness and detail is just stop down a little bit. In this case, using the 70-200 2.8, which becomes a 5.6, I'll typically stop down to f7 or f8 if I'm trying to freeze motion. It's a good compromise between getting some of that sharpness back but not losing too much light, and that typically works out pretty well. But again, it's not going to be as good as if I wasn't using the converter at all. Another thing you'll see anytime you use the 2x converter is a slight haze over the image that affects the color and contrast. It's not terrible, but you're definitely going to notice it. It seems like every shot you take was taken at high noon on a sunny day, and it just looks a little bit harsh and washed out. But it's not really that bad, and I can typically correct it in Lightroom, so it's not a huge issue. You can either just use the contrast slider or the dehaze slider, and that pretty much gets rid of it entirely. Another area that's going to be affected is the autofocus. Just like with image quality, anytime you're using the 2x converter, it's going to be compromised. In my experiences, I've missed shots because the focus was hunting around or was too slow to track a certain subject, and unlike image quality, where you can stop down to help prevent that loss of detail or get some of that detail back, with autofocus, it's a little bit more out of your control. There's some settings in the camera that you can change to optimize given whatever scenario you're in that particular day. But for the most part, this is probably the biggest drawback of using the 2x converter, is the loss in autofocus performance. I've tried a couple different things to help mitigate the autofocus issue, but at the end of the day, it's really out of your control, especially with fast-moving subjects, and it's not something that happens every time. It's less than 5% of the time, I'd say, and typically how I get around that is I'll just manually focus. So if it's a racing event, I'll focus on a point that I know the subject is going to come through, and I'll just get my shots that way. And that works fairly well, but obviously it's not as good as just having autofocus that tracks properly. But it is one strategy to help get around that. I initially bought the 2x converter to use with my 70-200 as a replacement for my 150-600. Since then, I've upgraded to a 400mm, but surprisingly, I still bring the 2x with me to pretty much every event I go to. The main reason is that it's just really compact, and there's not a huge penalty for just having it with me in my bag and having it there as an option, even though for me, image clarity, sharpness, and detail is typically a priority. Whether or not I use the 2x converter is typically determined by environmental factors. Knowing that I'm going to have to deal with a little bit of haze and loss of detail, shooting at high noon is probably not going to be such a good idea. Although sometimes I just like to throw it on and see what I get. It offers a different perspective that you can't quite get by cropping an image or by other means. So I just like to throw it on sometimes, even when I have the 400mm with me, because that gives me effectively an 800mm lens, and there's no way to replicate that kind of compression or that kind of zoom. So it's just a fun modifier to have and fun to experiment with. Surprisingly, the most annoying thing about using the 2x converter that I've found is actually just swapping it on and off the camera. So, you know, I just pulled it out of my bag, I've got the caps on it, and if I want to swap it on here, I've got to first get the caps off, which isn't too bad as I just dropped one on the floor, and then swap it onto the lens, not drop the camera, and then swap that all onto the body. So as you can see, that's a little bit cumbersome, and when you're doing that outside, one of the things that's going to happen is you're going to get dust into the camera, which is eventually going to make its way to the sensor, and you're going to be correcting all of those little dust spots in post, which is pretty annoying. Despite the inconvenience of swapping the converter on and off, I still find that it's an incredibly useful tool, and it offers me a lot of capability along with extra reach, and it shouldn't be underestimated. Like I said earlier, I bought the converter as an alternative to my 150-600 Sigma lens at the time, and I still maintain that I got better shots with the 70-200 and the 2x than I did with that Sigma. Ultimately, the 2x converter is just a tool and it should be treated as such. You can definitely get some great images with it, provided you understand the drawbacks and you can work around them, but it's definitely not a replacement for a proper long-range lens. If you plan on using the converter as a stopgap, it can definitely fill that role, and even when you upgrade further down the road, provided it's compatible, you can also use the converter with that lens as well. So if you are considering picking up a 2x converter, then I definitely recommend it both in the short and the long term. Just make sure that you look at some sample images beforehand with the particular lens that you're planning on using it on, because as we discussed earlier, the performance of the converter is highly dependent on the host lens. And what would even be better than looking at sample images is renting it and seeing what the performance is like firsthand, so that way you can manage your expectations. So if you made it this far, I hope it was helpful. If you did find this information useful, let me know what other camera gear you'd want to see in the future, and thanks for watching. Really, the best strategy for swapping the converter on and off the camera is just to get yourself an assistant who holds the camera. It's best if they know what they're doing. And then you can easily take the caps off, put them in your pocket, and then just do everything with two hands, which makes it much easier. And then you're good to go. That was my line. Oh. Today we're looking at the Canon 2X extender. I don't remember what else I was supposed to say.